Now welcome to another lightning response video where I take a question from the comments and try to answer it in a concise and timely manner, though something tells me this one might be a bit of a ramble. Anyway, this time the question comes to us from Cade Wren, who asked, "Hey Thor, do you think the original trilogy would be as loved if it came out after the prequels, or if the prequels and the originals switched eras they came out in? I have heard many say that if the films came out in chronological order, the OT would be hated, or at the very least it would be controversial, and I want to know your thoughts on this." And that kind of goes along with this comment. It's not a question really, from Bill Kammermeyer, who said, "My wife had never really seen all of the Star Wars movies, and when I had her watch episode 1 through 6 in order, she said, 'Finally it all makes sense now that I've seen them in order. Why did everything tell me to watch 4, 5, and 6 first?'" And there's also a response to that comment which basically kind of says or implies that the original trilogy lovers can't accept that the original trilogy didn't make sense before the prequels or on its own. Which, no offense, but that's a comment that really doesn't make sense to me as someone who's more than old enough to remember the original trilogy long before the prequels ever came out. Because when you consider the original trilogy stood on its own for roughly 2 decades, that there is a 16-year gap between the release of Return of the Jedi and then The Phantom Menace coming out, and that virtually no one in that time probably ever said in all those years of that gap that the Star Wars trilogy, it wouldn't have even been referred to as the original trilogy yet, that it doesn't make sense or feels incomplete somehow. Because in all reality, the original trilogy is a very, very simple and straightforward and complete story all on its own. That's one of the reasons I think it worked so well and hooked so many people, because it's very easy to understand and doesn't require you to do anything but go on the adventure with the characters. You don't need to know the context or backstory to enjoy what's right in front of you. More or less, it's a simple, fun, fast-paced story that if I had to describe it or boil it down to the most basic example I could give or basic description, I'd say it's the story of an evil empire that's ruling the galaxy and that must be stopped by a small band of rebels. And it turns out that one of the leaders of the empire used to be a Jedi, or a space wizard essentially, and is also the father of one of the leaders of the rebellion who is now trying to bring back the space wizards. And though you could say what the prequels end up doing is enhancing the original trilogy, that they flesh out the story further and add more context and stakes to everything we see in the original trilogy, in truth, or in all reality, what the prequels actually do is completely recontextualize the original trilogy. They attempt to change your perception of that story. Which, relax before you start hating on me, I'm not saying is a necessarily bad thing, but it is the truth. Those films, the prequels, or George Lucas with them, he adds a lot of things that clearly were not thought of or intended when the first 3 films were made. Because, despite what some people seem to believe, George Lucas did not have the entire story of Star Wars figured out from day one. There was no sort of eureka moment when every single detail of the Star Wars galaxy and the story it contains just kind of magically came to him all at once, and he's only been telling us that story ever since. Hell, it took 4 drafts to get the first Star Wars movie right, and there are a ton of changes made along the way in those scripts. Even throughout the original trilogy, he changes or adds things, like Vader being Luke's father was not the thought from the start, nor was making Luke and Leia twins. That didn't come about until making Return of the Jedi, and only after scrapping an idea to introduce a brand new character that would turn out to be Luke's long-lost sister, or the other Yoda spoke of in The Empire Strikes Back.
No, there is another.
Heck, originally Boba Fett was going to be a super or elite stormtrooper, not a bounty hunter. And so, going back to the original question now, about could the release of the trilogies be flipped and would it still work? The answer to that, in my opinion, is no, probably not. Or that plenty of people would be upset or not really like the original trilogy, because if they came out or were released in chronological order, if the prequels had somehow come out first, and let's not worry about the logistics of that, or the fact that visually the prequels look like newer films or have a whole lot of CGI that the originals obviously don't have. And let's also just assume the movies would be virtually identical, right? That nothing would be changed in the original trilogy films to fit what the prequels had started. Anyway, if the prequels came out first, I do think there would be people confused and upset about storylines from them just being completely dropped in the original trilogy. I mean, just look how upset people get about things in the sequel trilogy not carrying over from film to film. Things like the prophecy of the Chosen One are never even remotely touched on in the originals. That's part of what I'm talking about with recontextualization here. The prequels try to say the originals now conclude a prophecy that was never even remotely alluded to in the films, or probably even a thought in Lucas's head.
He is the Chosen One. He will bring balance.
Anakin in the original trilogy is just some fallen Jedi. He is not a Chosen One. Plus the whole, what you could call, Sith subplot, them wanting to rise up and take over the galaxy once more.
Once more, the Sith will rule the galaxy.
No one really even knows or cares what or who the Sith are because the name is never even uttered in the film. Though yes, there is a deleted scene where it is said, but that's it. In fact, when Timothy Zahn wrote Heir to the Empire, which is essentially the EU's version of a sequel to Return of the Jedi, he thought hearing that Darth Vader was the Dark Lord of the Sith, he thought that meant that the Sith were a race of people he was the Dark Lord over, not that the Sith was actually the name of the quote-unquote bad guys. And again, or to be clear, I'm not saying I hate what the prequels did. I actually am a huge fan of them, and I'm glad they expanded the story of the original trilogy. They do some fantastic world building that I absolutely love. Not to mention, yeah, I do enjoy the grander story it turned Star Wars into, which isn't to say the originals weren't a grand story either. And so, that said, I do completely understand why some people don't like the prequels because of what they did. They do recontextualize and change the original trilogy into something else entirely. They imply it's all about the story of Anakin Skywalker. They add things like a prophecy and midichlorians, but again, none of this is even remotely touched on in the original trilogy. No one ever thought of the originals as the story of Anakin Skywalker. It was always Luke's story. And that could bring us to the question of why do people who watch them for the first time today and who watch them in chronological order, why don't they complain about these dropped storylines or about how the prequels recontextualize the originals? And well, for one, they're not vested in it beforehand. They're going to form their initial opinions on the whole thing, prequels and originals, while simply watching them all back to back in probably a very timely manner. They're not, like some original trilogy fans, going to have years and years, decades, to watch the first 3 films 100 times each before watching the prequels. And so one of the reasons why I personally recommend people new to Star Wars watching the original trilogy first, like I did in that video yesterday, why I recommend watching it before you ever watch the prequels, is so they can just watch and enjoy what Star Wars originally was before the prequels expanded, and again, recontextualized it. Not to mention, I think nowadays people are sort of used to getting fully fleshed out backstories and context after the fact. In other words, the Star Wars prequels started a prequel craze, and people tend to be more accepting of a prequel adding to and inflating what the original was or recontextualizing it to some degree. Plus, as I've been saying, I don't think what the prequels did for the original trilogy was a bad thing. I don't mind them being recontextualized so much, even as someone who, yes, grew up and has a special place in their heart for the original trilogy. And so, in summary here, if the prequels came out first and there was a long gap between the originals coming out, yes, I do think people would be upset or disappointed that the story of Anakin that is built up so heavily in the prequels with the Chosen One thing and the rising up or revenge of the Sith, that they'd be upset or disappointed that it isn't really touched on at all in the original trilogy. That things like the balance of the Force are never touched on or talked about in the originals. For better or worse, I don't think the release could be flipped and have it work out the same. I do think people would be disappointed in the original trilogy, which is an odd thing for me to have to say. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Can the release order be flipped, and does it still work? Or by all means, you can ask me a question for a future lightning response video by starting your comment out with something like, "Hey Thor." Whatever the case may be, leave your comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.